One promise.
You call that a wound? The medic's voice cracked through 3 registers of alarm, each one higher than the last. Zeth Corvain had spent 40 years treating combat injuries across 9 war zones and 2 moons that didn't legally exist on any conquered star chart, and in all that time, no patient had ever laughed at him while bleeding. "Oh, it's a scratch," the human said. "Your arm is open to the bones." "Oh yeah, scratched it pretty good." Zeth stared at the ragged line of torn flesh running from elbow to wrist, at the shard of alloy still lodged an inch deep in the muscle, at the slow, steady pulse of blood soaking into the deck plating, and then at the human's face, which showed all the concern of someone commenting on the weather. "Sit down," Zeth said, "before you fall down." "I'm not going to fall down." He fell down 4 minutes later. The station was called Thessaly Anchor, a rusting waypoint bolted to the edge of contested space, where 3 empires had once drawn borders in blood and then spent 2 centuries pretending the blood had dried. It had been built originally by the Fahrenheit Compact as a refueling depot, sold twice, abandoned once, and reclaimed a decade ago as a neutral trade post. The kind of place where nobody asked questions they didn't want honest answers to, and everybody paid their docking fees in whatever currency still meant something that far out. Zeth had been stationed there for 6 years as senior medical officer, long enough to know every hull groan and pressure hiss the old station made, long enough to have stopped counting the ships that limped in more dead than alive. He had treated Serani soldiers with their strange triple-chambered hearts, Orni traders with skin that bruised the color of dusk, even once a Vashti diplomat who had nearly died of what turned out to be an allergic reaction to station-issue soap. He liked to think there was very little left out here that could surprise him. He had never treated a human before. Humans were rare out here, new to conquered space, still finding their feet, still being talked about in hushed tones by species who remembered things that hadn't happened yet, in a war that hadn't started yet, on a scale nobody wanted to say out loud. Humanity had entered known space only 9 years earlier, stumbling into a border skirmish between the Serani Dominion and a splinter Orni colony, and had ended it in 11 days without asking anyone's permission first. The official Concord report on the incident ran to 400 pages and concluded, in language so carefully hedged it read like a confession, that human military doctrine did not resemble any existing framework in Concord's records. Zeth had read the report twice. He still didn't fully understand it. Something about humans treating retreat as a tactical option rather than an admission of failure, about supply lines that moved faster than anyone thought physically reasonable, about a species that seemed to negotiate as fiercely as it fought and fight as carefully as it negotiated. Nobody in conquered space quite knew what to do with that, so mostly they watched, quietly, from a distance. And they waited to see which version of humanity would show up at their door first, the one that had ended a border war in 11 days, or the one that had, according to the same report, spent the better part of its own history at war with itself for reasons later generations could no longer fully explain. This one had come in on a supply runner with false transponder codes, and a hold full of refugees nobody was supposed to know about. His name, according to the manifest, was Ellison Vance, 34 years old. Listed occupation, civilian contractor. Zeth had read enough manifests to know that phrase meant something else entirely. "You want to tell me how a civilian contractor gets a piece of shrapnel buried in his arm?" Zeth asked, once the anesthetic had finally convinced Ellison's nervous system to stop arguing with him. "A cargo shifted." "A cargo doesn't shift at 40 meters per second. Ellison didn't answer that. His eyes had gone distant, fixed on some middle point in the air, the particular stillness of a man doing math he didn't want to share. Zeth let it go for now. Word of the scratch spread through the station faster than the infection would have, if Ellison had let it fester the way he seemed intent on doing. He said it was fine, Zeth told Administrator Paluket 2 days later in the tired voice of a man still working through disbelief. There was bone exposed. He said it was fine and asked if there was anywhere on the station that served coffee. Paluket was Faranai, a species built low and wide with skin like tempered ceramic, built for pressure and patience in equal measure. She had run Thessaly Anchor for 11 years and had learned to treat every new piece of information as a puzzle piece before deciding whether it was dangerous. Humans, she said, I've read the reports. Serrani ran into a human patrol vessel 8 months ago near the Vale border. Their engagement summary used the phrase anomalous pain response 4 separate times. Anomalous how? They didn't have one. Not in any measurable way the Serrani's instruments could confirm from external readings, but their boarding team reported a human continuing combat with a compound fracture in his leg, one they described as obviously identifiable to a first-year medical cadet. He apparently only stopped fighting when he ran out of ammunition, not when the leg gave out. Zeth sat with that for a long moment. That's not right, he said finally. Biologically, pain is a survival mechanism. A species that didn't feel injury correctly would have died out in its own infancy. That's the theory I favor as well, Paluket said, which means the explanation is worse. Worse how? They feel it, she said. They simply don't let it decide anything. There was a silence after that, the kind that settled into the corners of a room and stayed there. Zeth had spent his career believing pain was an honest signal, that the body did not lie about damage, that when something screamed, it screamed because it needed to. The idea of a species that had learned to talk over that scream to negotiate with it unsettled him in a way he didn't have a clean word for yet. Or should we be concerned, he asked. Paluket considered the question with the same unhurried weight she gave every decision that mattered. I don't think concern is the right instinct, she said eventually. I think the right instinct is attention. A species that can override its own alarms is either extraordinarily disciplined or extraordinarily reckless with itself. I would like to know which before I decide how much to trust one of them on my station. Ellison stayed on the station for 11 days while his arm healed, officially waiting for a transport window, unofficially, Zeth suspected, waiting for something else entirely. He spent most of that time in the observation lounge, watching the star traffic with the same still, calculating look he'd had on the table. Zeth found himself drawn back to him. Not out of professional obligation, the wound was healing clean, no further visits required. But out of something closer to unease, the kind a person feels standing near a locked door they've been told not to open. You don't talk about the refugees, Zeth said on the 4th day, setting 2 cups of station-brewed coffee on the table between them. It tasted like burnt insulation. Ellison drank it like it was fine wine. Nothing to talk about, I found them, I moved them, job's done. 14 Orani children and their guardians pulled out of a labor colony that officially closed 6 years ago. That's not nothing. Ellison's jaw tightened just slightly, the first genuine reaction Zeth had gotten out of him in 4 days. That colony didn't close, it got quiet, different thing. How did you know it was still operating? I didn't. I went looking because a woman on a comm relay 3 jumps from here mentioned her sister stopped writing 7 years ago and the last letter said the water tasted like metal. Ellison turned his cup slowly on the table, not drinking, just turning it, a small ritual of hands that needed something to do. Took me 4 months to find the place. Another 2 to figure out how to get in without anyone official knowing I was there. Why not go through conquered channels? Report it, let the proper authorities. I did 18 months before that. Concord flagged it as unverified, low-priority, insufficient evidence for intervention. He said the words with the flat precision of someone quoting a document he'd read so many times it had worn a groove into his memory. By the time anyone with a badge would have gotten around to it, that letter would have been the last thing anyone ever heard from that colony. Zeth said nothing, there was nothing safe to say. So yeah, Ellison said, finally taking a drink of the terrible coffee. Civilian contractor. I contract myself to go find the things everyone agreed weren't worth finding. That's not a job, that's a vow. Didn't realize there was a difference out here. Over the following days, Zeth began noticing things about Ellison the way a physician notices things, small, involuntary tells that told a different story than the words attached to them. He noticed that Ellison never sat with his back to a door, not even in the relative safety of a medical bay on a neutral station. He noticed that Ellison ate whatever was put in front of him without complaint or preference, the way people eat who have gone long stretches learning not to be particular about food. He noticed that Ellison slept in short, disciplined blocks. Zeth checked the medical bays overnight, monitoring more than once out of curiosity that edged toward concern, never more than 3 hours at a stretch, always waking at the same inter. Val, like a man whose body had once been trained to expect an alarm that no longer came, and had never quite unlearned the rhythm. And he noticed the way Ellison looked at the Oronai children in the guest quarters, not with pity, which Zeth had expected, but with something closer to fierce, private relief, the look of a man confirming to himself that a bet he'd made with his own life had paid off. You visit them every day, Zeth observed, on the 6th day, finding Ellison in the observation lounge with 2 of the older children, teaching them some card game Zeth didn't recognize using a deck he'd apparently built from cut-up ration wrappers. They don't know anyone else here. Doesn't cost me anything to make sure they're not scared. And it costs you time, rest, you're still healing. I've got plenty of that to spare, Ellison said without looking up from the cards. Time, I mean, not sure about the other thing. One of the children, a small Oronai girl with dust-colored bruising along her collarbone that Zeth suspected had nothing to do with any recent injury and everything to do with years of malnutrition, looked up at Ellison with an expression Zeth had seen before on other faces in other wars. It was the look of someone who has decided, against every reasonable instinct built by hard experience, to trust a stranger completely. Are you going to leave soon? She asked in halting Concord standard. Not before you're somewhere safe, Ellison said. That's a promise, not a maybe. You promise a lot of things. I only promise things I've already decided are true, he said. The trick is not promising anything until after you've made up your mind. Most people do it backwards. Zeth filed that away with everything else he was collecting, a slow, uneasy portrait assembling itself out of small moments, of a man who had built an entire philosophy of survival around the idea that his word, once given, was a fixed point in an otherwise chaotic universe, and who seemed to have arrived at that philosophy through some cost Zeth was only beginning to guess the size of. It was on the 7th day that the Serrani patrol boat arrived, uninvited, with weapons hot and a very specific demand. Zeth watched it happen from the medical bay's exterior camera feed, because Paluket had, with characteristic bluntness, ordered every civilian off the command deck the moment the Serrani vessel had broken formation and begun its approach vector. They want the refugees back, Paluket said over the comm, her voice carrying the particular calm of someone who had already decided how this would end and was simply working through the steps to get there. Their claim is that the Oronai colonists are indentured labor under a legally binding contract, and Thessaly Anchor is harboring contracted personnel in violation of trade law. That's not indenture, Ellison said. He'd appeared in the medical bay doorway without Zeth noticing, arm still in its brace, face unreadable. That's slavery with a receipt. I'm aware of the distinction, Paluket said. The Serrani vessel is not. How many crew on that ship? 40 standard patrol configuration. Why? Ellison didn't answer, he was already moving. What happened next would be retold, in fragments and half versions, across 3 different sectors over the following months. because nobody who witnessed it firsthand agreed entirely on what they'd seen, only on the fact that it had happened and that it had ended without a single shot fired. Ellison didn't go to a weapons locker. He went to the comms room. He opened a channel to the Serrani vessel, not to Paluket, not to station security, but directly ship to ship in a voice Zeth had never heard him use before. Level, unhurried, the voice of a man reading out terms, not making a threat. "You're here for 14 children," Ellison said. "I know the captain of that labor colony. I know his name, his registration number, and the account he used to receive payment for delivering those children 3 years ago. I know because I spent 4 months finding it, and I have copies of everything, stored in 6 places you will never find, set to release automatically to Concord Judicial, Serrani Internal Affairs, and every major news relay in this sector if I don't personally cancel the release order every 30 days. Silence on the other end. Zeth found he was holding his breaths. "I haven't canceled it in 11 days, Ellison continued. "You have 19 left before it goes out on its own with or without me, so here's what happens now. You can leave and I keep sitting on that information the way I have been, or you can take those children and I stop sitting on it." "You're bluffing," the Serrani captain's voice crackled back, edged with the particular anger of someone who suspected he wasn't. "I found 4 months' worth of evidence a licensed Concord investigation team decided wasn't worth their time," Ellison said. "I'm not the one you should be worried is bluffing." The silence that followed lasted 11 seconds. Zeth counted every one of them. "You understand," the captain said finally, his voice tighter now, "that this isn't personal. There are people above me who assign this recovery. If I return without the cargo, that becomes my problem, not theirs." "Then here's a thought," Ellison said, and for the first time there was something almost gentle underneath the steel of his voice. "Tell them the cargo resisted extraction and the recovery attempt failed due to unforeseen defensive countermeasures. It's not even a lie. I am technically an unforeseen defensive countermeasure." There was a long pause, and then, astonishingly, something that might have been a huff of grim amusement on the other end of the channel. "You're an unusual negotiator, humans, as I've been told." Then the Serrani vessel broke orbit and left. "That was reckless," Paluket said later, in the tone of someone who meant that was extraordinary but had decided reckless was the safer word to use out loud. "It worked. It worked because you were telling the truth. What if you hadn't been?" "I don't bluff about things that matter," Ellison said. "Bluffing gets people killed by making them think you're less dangerous than you are. I'd rather people think I'm more." Zeth, standing at the edge of the room with a diagnostic tablet he'd stopped actually reading 5 minutes ago, found himself looking at Ellison's bandaged arm. The wound that should have, by any reasonable medical standard, still had this man flat on his back and drugged into stillness. Instead, he just talked down an armed vessel with 40 crew using nothing but a level voice and the absolute certainty that he would follow through. "Can I ask you something?" Zeth said. "Go ahead." "Back on the table that first day, you genuinely didn't think that wound was serious." "It wasn't. Your bone was visible." Ellison considered this the way a man considers a question in a language he mostly understands but has never had to answer before. "I've had worse," he said finally. "I know what worse feels like. This wasn't that." "How much worse is worse?" Something shifted behind Ellison's eyes, not pain exactly, but the shadow pain leaves behind after it's gone. "There was a winter," he said, "long time ago, before any of this. I was 17 and it was 40 below and I walked 6 kilometers on a broken ankle because stopping meant freezing and stopping was worse than the ankle." He shrugged, the gesture at odds with the weight of what he'd just said. "After that, most things measure pretty small." "That's not a healthy baseline," Zeth said quietly. "No," Ellison agreed. "It's not, but it's an honest one. And honestly, Doc, it's the reason those 14 kids are asleep in guest quarters instead of still in that colony. If I measured pain the way you do, I'd have stopped a long time before I found them." Zeth had no answer for that. He wasn't sure there was one. In the days that followed, Paluket grew quieter, more watchful, spending long hours reviewing sensor logs from the Serani vessel's departure and cross-referencing them against Concord's public shipping registries. Zeth found her at it one evening, the observation deck lit only by the pale wash of instrument displays. "You're worried they'll come back," he said. "I'm worried about what they'll bring with them if they do." She didn't look up from the display. A single patrol boat backing down from one man's bluff is an embarrassment. Embarrassment in a hierarchy like the Serani Dominion does not simply disappear. It gets reassigned upward until someone with enough authority to erase it decides how. "You think this isn't over?" "I think," she said, "that men like Ellison Vance rarely get to walk away from the debts they collect on other people's behalf without someone eventually presenting a bill." Zeth thought of the girl with the dust-colored bruises, of Ellison's card game built from ration wrappers, of a promise made and apparently already kept. He thought, too, of the 6 kilometers on a broken ankle, and wondered what it meant that a man could learn to carry that kind of weight and still choose over and over to pick up more. The mid-story truth, the one that reframed everything Zeth thought he understood about the man in front of him, arrived not through Ellison himself but through the station archive. A routine background check Paluket ran on every long-term visitor standard procedure, nothing suspicious in the request. What came back was 3 lines long and took the ground out from under Zeth's certainty entirely. Ellison Vance, no listed employer, no listed nation of origin, no listed medical record prior to 11 years ago. "He doesn't exist before 11 years ago," Paluket said, sliding the tablet across the desk. "Not in any database Concord has access to. It's like he was born an adult mid-decade with a face and a name and nothing behind either." "People erase their records," Zeth said. "For protection, it doesn't mean." "I know what erased records look like, Zeth. I've seen thousands. They have edges, a gap where something used to be, seams where the deletion happened. This isn't erased." She tapped the screen. "This is absent. There's no seam. Nothing was ever there to begin with." Zeth found Ellison in the observation lounge that evening, same seat, same stillness, watching the same unchanging stars. "You want to ask me something," Ellison said without turning. "11 years ago, what happened?" For a long moment, Ellison said nothing at all, and Zeth thought he might simply deflect, the way he deflected every question so far that got too close to the center of him. Instead, he spoke. "Earth used to fight itself," he said, "constantly for most of its history. Different flags, different reasons, same basic math, people hurting people, generation after generation, and every generation telling itself this time it would be the last time." He paused. 11 years ago, we stopped." "Just stopped." "Not overnight. It took decades before that, and it wasn't clean, and a lot of people didn't live to see it finished. But 11 years ago was when the last of it ended, the last war, the last flag drawn against another flag on the same planet." His voice had gone very quiet. "I fought in the tail end of it. Before that, there's nothing in any database because before that I wasn't Ellison Vance. I was a soldier in a war that doesn't have a name anymore, on the losing side of a border that doesn't exist anymore, for a country that doesn't file paperwork under names humans use now." "You erased yourself." "I let myself end," Ellison said, "and I let someone new start. Someone who decided that if humanity was finally done spending itself on itself, the least I could do was spend what was left of me on people nobody else would bother looking for." "What was your names before?" Ellison was quiet for a long moment. "Doesn't matter anymore. That man made choices I don't get to take back in a war I don't get to explain to anyone who wasn't there without making it sound smaller than it was or worse than it was depending on the day. Ellison Vance doesn't carry that name. He carries what that man learned instead, seemed like the more useful inheritance. And what did he learn? That wars end eventually, Ellison said. Every single one. The only question that ever really matters is what's left standing when they do, and whether any of it was worth the ending. I spent a long time on the wrong side of that question. I'd like to spend whatever's left of me making sure other people don't have to. Zeth sat with that for a long time before he found words. That's not a scratch, he said finally. That ankle, that war, none of it was ever a scratch. No, Ellison agreed, but I already knew what the real wounds felt like. Everything since has just been math. He was quiet for a while after that, long enough that Zeth thought the conversation had ended. Then, unprompted, in a voice that had gone somewhere far away, Ellison kept talking, as if the door he'd opened had let something out that no longer wanted to go back in. The winter I told you about, he said. It wasn't really about the ankle. There was a boy with me, younger than me, maybe 15, from a unit that had gotten scattered 2 days earlier. I didn't know his name, we'd never officially met, just ended up walking the same direction out of the same ruin. He had a chest wound that wasn't going to close no matter what either of us did about it, and we both knew it, and neither of us said so out loud, because saying it would have made stopping to say goodbye to each other feel like giving up before either of us was ready to. What happened to him? He talked the whole 6 kilometers, Ellison said. About nothing, about a dog he used to have, about a girl who worked at a bakery near where he grew up and never once looked at him twice. About the taste of bread that didn't exist anymore because the bakery had been gone for 2 years by then, along with the street it was on. He just talked. And I listened because it was the only thing I had left to give him. And because listening was easier than thinking about my own ankle or his chest or the 6 kilometers we still had left. Or did he make it? He stopped talking about 400 meters from the checkpoint, Ellison said. I carried him the rest of the way. Knew before I got there that it didn't matter anymore, but I carried him anyway because stopping felt like admitting something I wasn't ready to admit, and because some part of me thought maybe walking fast enough could still argue with the math. He looked down at his hands, turning them over slowly, the way a man looks at tools he's used for something he wished they'd never had to do. That's the day I learned the difference between pain that means something and paw. In That's Just Noise, my ankle was noise. Everything else that day was the real signal. I've been listening for that difference ever since in every wound I've had since, including the ones that actually needed listening to. You never told anyone that story before. Wasn't relevant before, Ellison said. You asked what worse meant, that's what worse means. Everything since has been easier by comparison, even when it technically shouldn't have been. I know that's not healthy, Doc. You've already told me as much, and you're not wrong. But it's kept 14 kids breathing regular air on a transport with new names, so I've made my peace with the parts of me it costs to keep doing this. Zeth said nothing for a long time. There was nothing adequate to say to a man who had built an entire capacity for extraordinary sacrifice out of the wreckage of a walk he never should have had to make. At an age he never should have had to make it. He thought instead of every patient he had treated who insisted their pain was smaller than it was, and wondered, for the first time in 40 years of practicing medicine, whether some of them had been doing the same quiet arithmetic Ellison had just described, measuring every new wound against an old one large enough to make everything else feel survivable by comparison. For what it's worth, Zeth said eventually, I don't think that boy would begrudge you the peace you've made. 6 kilometers is a long way to carry someone. Most people wouldn't have made it 100 meters. Most people don't get put in a position to find out what they'd carry, Ellison said. I got unlucky that way early. Figured the least I could do with the unlucky part was make it useful to somebody eventually. News of what had happened at the labor colony, the quiet extraction, the 14 children, the letter that had finally reached the right person, began in the way such things do to travel. Not through official channels, which had shown no particular urgency about any of it, but through the informal networks that moved faster and more honestly than paperwork ever could. Dock workers, relay operators, the quiet fraternity of people who noticed things, and occasionally told the right person what they'd noticed. Within 2 weeks, 3 more messages arrived at Thessaly Anchor, addressed not to the station but to the contractor, care of whoever might know where to find him. Zeth watched Ellison read each one at the same table in the observation lounge, watched his jaw tighten in the same specific way each time, watched him fold each message with the same careful, deliberate motion before tucking it away. More letters, Zeth said on the third one. More silences, Ellison corrected. A letter's just the shape a silence takes when somebody finally decides to say something about it. You're going to go after all 3. I'm going to go after whichever one's running out of time fastest. The other 2 can wait. Waiting isn't the same as being abandoned, Doc. I learned that difference the hard way, and it's the only thing that lets me sleep at night knowing which is which. Oh, you can't save everyone. No, Ellison agreed, folding the third letter with the same unhurried care as the first 2. But I can make sure the math on how many I don't save is a number I chose, and not a number some committee decided was an acceptable loss. It was the closest thing to anger Zeth had heard in his voice, yet not loud, never loud but present, banked like a coal that had been burning a long time, and had simply learned not to show its heat on the surface. In the days before the strike force arrived, Ellison did something Zeth hadn't expected. He began quietly training the station's small security detachment, a handful of Fahrenheit and one nervous Oronai deckhand who had never fired anything more dangerous than a cargo winch. You don't need to be soldiers, Ellison told them in the cramped equipment bay that doubled as a firing range when nobody official was watching. You need to survive the first 90 seconds of something going wrong. Everything after that you can figure out as you go. Nobody figures anything out in the first 90 seconds. They just try not to die in them. Ren Akoy, the security officer who would later describe Ellison's fight in such careful, reverent detail, was the most skeptical of the group at first. Fahrenheit training emphasized discipline, formation, the patient application of overwhelming defensive posture. Everything Ellison's loose, adaptive instructions seemed to contradict. This isn't how we're taught to hold a position, Akoy said, on the second day, after Ellison had spent 20 minutes explaining why standing perfectly still behind cover was sometimes the most dangerous thing a person could do. You're not being taught to hold a position, Ellison said. You're being taught to still be alive in an hour. Those aren't always the same lesson. He adjusted T. He angle of Akoy's stance with 2 fingers unhurried. Positions can be retaken, people can't. You talk like you expect something to happen. I always expect something to happen, Ellison said. It's not pessimism. It's just accounting for the version of events where I'm wrong about how safe things look. By the 4th day, even the nervous Oronai deckhand, a young man named Pethkorian who had taken the job on Thessaly Anchor specifically because it was supposed to be quiet, could disassemble and reassemble a defense platform's targeting array in under 3 minutes, blindfolded, because Ellison had insisted that hands needed to know a job the eyes couldn't always be trusted to see clearly during a crisis. Why does this matter so much to you? Akoy asked him near the end of that session, watching Ellison patiently correct Peth's grip for the 11th time that hour. You'll be gone in a few weeks. This isn't your station to protect. Every station's my station while I'm standing on it, Ellison said. Where I come from, we learned the hard way that the people who show up already knowing how to survive the first 90 seconds are the ones who get to have a 10th year and a 20th, and eventually get old enough to forget they were ever scared in the first place. I'd like all of you to get old enough to forget. Akoy didn't have a response to that. None of them did. But when the Serrani strike force arrived 9 days later, it was Akoi who reached the defense platform corridor first, weapon steady, stance exactly as Ellison had corrected it, and it was Akoi's account, delivered later with quiet, lasting respect that would preserve the true shape of what happened in those 11 minutes for everyone who hadn't been there to see it. The Serrani did not accept their loss quietly. 9 days after the standoff, 3 vessels arrived at Thessaly Anchor's outer perimeter. Not a patrol boat this time, but a strike formation, weapons already charged, no hail, no warning. Paluket's voice, when it came over the station-wide comm, had lost every trace of its usual calm. All personnel to shelter stations. This is not a drill. Zeth found Ellison already in the medical bay when he arrived, quietly checking the supply lockers, counting trauma kits with the efficiency of a man who had done this exact task in exactly this kind of hurry more times than he could count. "They're not here for the children this time," Ellison said without looking up. "They're here to make an example, erase the evidence, erase the man who found it, erase the witnesses. Standard cleanup." A standard for who? For anyone who's ever tried to bury something that mattered. He straightened, closed the locker, turned to face Zeth fully. "Doc, I need you to listen to me carefully because I'm about to ask you to do something that's going to feel wrong, and I need you to do it anyway." "What?" "When this is over, whatever happens to me, those 14 children go on the next transport out. No exceptions, no delays, no waiting to see how anything shakes out. You get them off this station within the hour if it comes to it. Promise me." "You're talking like you're not going to be here to see it through." "I'm talking like a man who plans for the version of this where I'm not," Ellison said. "That's not pessimism, Doc, that's just math." "There has to be another way. Paluket can hail Concord Judicial, use your evidence as leverage." Concord Judicial took 18 months to flag a labor colony as low priority the first time, Ellison said. "We don't have 18 months. We don't have 18 hours. This gets solved in the next few minutes, one way or another, and I'd rather it be solved by someone who's already decided what he's willing to spend than by a committee deciding it for me after the fact." He checked the charge on a small sidearm Zeth hadn't even noticed him carrying, and then, almost as an afterthought, added, "Doc, whatever you see in the next few minutes, don't come out onto the deck. Not for anything, not even for me." "Oh, Ellison, promise me that too." Zeth promised. It was the hardest promise he had ever made, and he would spend the following 11 minutes wondering if it had been the wrong one. The battle for Thessaly Anchor lasted 11 minutes, and Zeth watched almost none of it directly. He was in the medical bay, preparing for the wounded that would inevitably come, and there were many, because Fahrenheit hull plating was not built to withstand a coordinated strike from 3 armed vessels. What he learned afterward, pieced together from station logs and the halting accounts of security personnel who had seen it happen, was this. Ellison Vance had not hidden. He had not sheltered. He had gone, alone and without authorization, to the station's small defense platform, a single aging point defense cannon that hadn't been used in active combat in over a decade, and he had used it not to fight 3 warships head-on, which would have been suicide, and he knew it, but to do something far more precise. He had targeted, with surgical accuracy across 11 minutes of continuous fire, the maneuvering thrusters of all 3 vessels. Never the hulls, never the crew compartments, never a killing blow. Just enough damage applied with ruthless consistency to strip each ship of the ability to hold formation, to aim, to coordinate. Not destruction, disablement. Security Officer Ren Akoi, who had been stationed nearest the defense platform and had disobeyed 3 separate orders to fall back in order to keep visual on what was happening, would later describe it this way. He wasn't fighting like a man trying to win. He was fighting like a man doing very careful arithmetic under fire and somehow getting every single number right. Twice during those 11 minutes, the lead Serrani vessel came close enough to land a killing shot on the exposed defense platform. Twice, Ellison rolled the aging cannon's mount at the last possible instant, taking glancing damage instead of a direct hit, and kept firing before the smoke from his own scorched armor had even cleared. Alcoy reported that at one point over the platform's open comm channel, accidentally left active, never meant to be heard, Ellison could be heard counting under his breath. Not a countdown, a ledger. 14 kids, 3 letters, 1 promise. Over and over like a man reminding himself mid-fire exactly what the math was for. By the time the Serrani strike force limped away, dead in the water on backup systems, not a single person aboard any of the 3 vessels had died. And not a single person aboard Thessaly Anchor had died either. Except Ellison Vance, who took a piece of shrapnel through the shoulder during the 9th minute, kept firing until the 11th, and collapsed the moment the last vessel broke off. This, Zeth said, hands already moving, voice tight with an urgency he hadn't let himself feel until this exact moment, is not a scratch. Ellison's eyes were open, distant, the same faraway calculating stillness Zeth had seen 100 times now. Except this time it was fighting against something that wanted to pull him under. Didn't say it was, Ellison managed. His voice had gone thin, stretched over something Zeth recognized with a cold drop in his chest as real, unmistakable pain, finally showing itself after 11 years of practiced silence. This one actually hurts, Doc. Good, Zeth said and meant it with everything in him. Good, stay with that, stay with the hurt. Don't you dare let it go quiet on me. Wasn't planning to, Ellison whispered. And for the first time since Zeth had met him, there was nothing measured in his voice at all. Just a man, finally, letting himself feel exactly as much as the moment demanded. Paluket arrived moments later, station security in tow, her usual unshakable calm cracked wide open by what she'd seen on the platform feeds. She said nothing as Zeth worked, only stood at the edge of the medical bay watching a species she had spent 6 years cautiously studying reveal, in the space of 11 minutes, exactly how far it was willing to go for people who weren't even its own. The children, Ellison said through gritted teeth as Zeth worked to stabilize the bleeding. Doc, the children are exactly where they were an hour ago, Paluket said, stepping forward. Safe, asleep. None of them even woke for the attack. You kept your promise, Mr. Vance, before you'd even finished making it. Something in Ellison's face eased at that. Some tension Zeth hadn't fully registered until it was gone. Good, he murmured. Good. That's the only part of the math that actually mattered. Then his eyes rolled back and the monitors began screaming, and Zeth stopped having time to think about anything except keeping him alive. He lived. It took 9 days in critical care, 4 surgeries, and every piece of skill Zeth had accumulated across 40 years and 9 war zones. But he lived. And on the 10th day, when he was finally lucid enough to sit up and complain about the coffee again, Zeth found him already staring out at the same unchanging stars from a wheelchair he'd clearly been told not to leave his room without. You disabled 3 warships alone, Zeth said, sitting across from him. You could have died doing it a dozen different ways. 14 kids were on this station, Ellison said, like that was the whole of the explanation because to him it was. Why didn't you destroy the ships? You had the angle. Everyone said you had the angle. Ellison was quiet for a moment. Because those crews didn't choose the order they were given. Somebody above them did, killing 40 people to punish one bad decision from someone who isn't even on those ships. That's not justice. That's just more of the same math that got us here in the first place. He looked over at Zeth. I told you, 11 years ago we stopped doing that math. I wasn't about to start it again for someone else's war. The Serrani captain, the one from the first standoff, was he on one of those ships? He was in command of the lead vessel, Ellison said. I recognized his voice before I ever saw a name. I could have ended his career, his ship, everything in about 4 seconds. Would have been the easiest 4 seconds of the whole fight. Why didn't you? Because somewhere under all that armor plating and all that anger, that man made a choice not to force this the first time I asked him not to. That matters. It doesn't erase what he came back to do, but it matters. Ellison shifted carefully in the wheelchair, wincing. People aren't just the worst decision they've ever made, Doc. If they were, there wouldn't have been anybody left to build anything back home after we finally stopped tearing each other apart. I try to leave room for that, even out here. Especially out here. Zeth found he had no response worth giving. He simply sat in the quiet beside a man who measured his own suffering against a winter that had nearly killed him at 17, and measured everyone else's safety as worth more than his own certainty of survival, and who, even in the aftermath of nearly dying to protect them, still found room to extend something like mercy to the people who had come to kill him. Paluquette visited that same afternoon, carrying with her a tablet and an expression Zeth had rarely seen on her in 6 years of working alongside her. Something that looked almost like wonder, carefully restrained behind Fahrenheit composure. The Serrani Dominion has issued a formal statement, she said, setting the tablet on the table between them. Regarding the labor colony, regarding the strike force, regarding you specifically, Mr. Vance. Let me guess, they're calling me a terrorist. They're calling the colony's operator a rogue actor who exceeded his authority, and they've launched what they're describing as a full internal review of his operations. She tapped the tablet. Your evidence release didn't even need to trigger. Word of the strike force's failure reached Serrani's Central Command faster than your 30-day window could have. Someone very high up decided that an unresolved scandal was less dangerous than a confirmed one they could control the narrative around. So they're burying it their way instead of the truth's way. Perhaps, Paluquette allowed, but the colony is being formally dissolved. The remaining workers, adults this time, not children, are being processed for relocation under Concord oversight, which is more oversight than that colony has seen in 6 years. It is not justice, Mr. Vance, but it is considerably more than unverified low priority ever offered them. Ellison absorbed this for a long moment. It'll do, he said finally. It's not the ending I'd have written, but it'll do. May I ask what ending you would have written? Ellison thought about it for a moment. One where nobody had to write a letter in the first place, he said. One where a colony like that never gets to open its doors, let alone stay open 6 years past the point somebody decided to stop asking questions about it. That's the ending I actually want. This one's just the ending I could get with the tools I had in the time I had to use them. I've learned to be grateful for the second kind, even while I keep working toward the first. Paluquette studied him for a long moment. You speak of this the way a physician speaks of a difficult case, she said, managing symptoms while the underlying condition remains untreated. That's not a bad way to put it, Ellison said. Doc here would probably agree the analogy holds. The galaxy's got a chronic condition administrator. Places like that colony are the symptom. I'm not naive enough to think one contractor with a grudge and a good memory is going to cure it. I'm just trying to keep enough people breathing until somebody smarter than me figures out the actual treatment. And if no one ever does, then I keep managing symptoms, Ellison said, for as long as there's breath left in me to do it. Wasn't looking for a cure when I started. Was looking for a reason to keep going after the last one ran out. Turned out to be the same thing in the end. There is something else, Paluquette added, more carefully now. Word of what happened here has reached beyond Serrani channels. 3 separate Concord member species have submitted inquiries to this station, asking after the human contractor who disabled a strike force without a single casualty on either side. One of them was, I believe, attempting to offer you formal employment. Not interested. I told them as much. I suspect they will ask again. They can ask as many times as they like, Ellison said. I don't work for anyone who'd want to put a flag on what I do. The moment there's a flag, there's a chain of command, and the moment there's a chain of command, there's someone above me deciding whose letters are worth answering and whose aren't. I've had enough of that math already. Did it for real once for a war with a name I don't say out loud anymore. Not doing it again for a paycheck. Paluquette studied him for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind her ceramic-toned features. For what it's worth, Mr. Vance, she said finally, I have run this station for 11 years and hosted representatives of 41 species passing through it. I have never in that time seen anyone choose disablement over destruction when destruction was not only available, but arguably justified. I would like you to know that I noticed. Appreciate that, Ellison said. Doesn't change what I plan to do next, though. I did not expect it to. The 14 children left on the next transport, exactly as promised, exactly on schedule, with new names on new manifests and a future that no longer had a labor colony waiting at the end of it. Zeth watched them go from the observation deck, standing beside Paluquette, who had said very little since the attack beyond the necessary logistics of running a station that had nearly not survived it. The girl with the dust-colored bruises, Zeth had learned her name by then. Elira stopped at the departure gate before boarding turned and ran back across the deck to where Ellison sat in his wheelchair, still healing, still stubbornly insisting he didn't need the assistance rail Zeth had installed along the corridor. You said you'd stay until we were safe, she said. Are we safe now? You're about to be safer than you've ever been, Ellison said. New names, new world, people who will actually ask what you need instead of what you can be made to do. That's about as safe as this galaxy gets, kid. Are you coming with us? No, Ellison said gently. There's other letters, other silences. But I'll tell you what I told you the first night I found you. I only promise things I've already decided are true. I promised you'd be safe. You are, that promise is done. It doesn't need me standing next to it anymore to keep being true. Elira studied him with the particular seriousness only children seem capable of, weighing an adult's words against an adult's actions and finding, evidently, that they matched. Okay, she said finally, and hugged him carefully, mindful of the bandages, in a way that suggested someone had already explained to her exactly where not to squeeze. Thank you for finding my letter. Thank your aunt for writing it, Ellison said. I just went looking. She's the one who refused to stay quiet. She left, the transport doors closed, and Ellison sat very still for a long moment afterward, watching the space where she'd been standing, before Zeth quietly wheeled him back toward the medical bay without either of them saying anything more about it. He'll do it again, Paluquette said eventually, once the transport had cleared the docking clamps and vanished into the star field. Somewhere else, some other colony, some other letter that stopped arriving. As I know, does that not concern you? Zeth thought about the man in the wheelchair, still recovering, still insisting the pain medication was stronger than necessary, still turning his coffee cup in slow circles when he thought no one was watching. It should, Zeth admitted, but I keep thinking about that first day. Bone exposed, blood on my deck, and he called it a scratch. He shook his head slowly. I used to think that meant he didn't understand what pain was. Now I think he understood it better than anyone I've ever treated. He just decided a long time ago exactly what it was worth spending and on what. Ellison left Thessaly Anchor 3 weeks later, on a transport with no listed destination the way he'd arrived. Zeth walked him to the departure bay, an unspoken formality neither of them acknowledged out loud. You'll find another letter, Zeth said. Another colony, another silence somebody should have noticed sooner. Probably, Ellison said. And you'll go. Probably. Try, Zeth said, not to call the next one a scratch either. Something that might have been the beginning of a smile crossed Ellison's face there and gone. No promises, Doc. One more thing, Zeth said before Ellison could turn toward the gate. That man you used to be before Ellison Vance, does he ever get tired of being carried around like this, like a ledger somebody keeps having to balance? Ellison considered the question with more weight than Zeth had expected. Every day, he admitted. But tired isn't the same as done. I learned that on a broken ankle in the snow a long time before I learned anything else worth knowing. You don't stop because you're tired. You stop when the thing you're walking toward isn't worth the walk anymore. He looked out at the star field beyond the viewport, and for just a moment, something almost peaceful settled over his face. Fort. N kids on a transport with new names. That's worth the walk, doc, every step of it. He boarded without ceremony, and the transport pulled away without fanfare. And Thessaly Anchor went back to being exactly what it had always been, a rusting waypoint at the edge of contested space. Unremarkable in every way except for the 11 minutes it would take years for anyone to properly explain. Years later, long after Zeth had retired from station medicine and settled into a quieter post training young Fahrenheit physicians on a green world far from any contested border, a former security officer from Thessaly Anchor tracked him down over a long-distance comm channel, mostly to reminisce, the way old colleagues sometimes do. "You remember the human?" the officer asked. Vance. "I remember him. There's a story going around Concord medical circles about a labor colony 3 sectors over that just disappeared off every registry, quietly, no incident report, no diplomatic fallout, just gone like it was never there. Word is a single unregistered contractor was seen leaving the sector 2 days before it happened." Zeth said nothing for a long moment, looking out at the green fields beyond his window, thinking of a man who measured pain against a winter that nearly killed him, who called an exposed bone a scratch, who had once told a Serrani warship captain that he would rather be feared as more dangerous than he was than trusted as less. "Sounds like him," Zeth said finally. "Oh, you think it was?" "I think," Zeth said, "there's probably a letter somewhere that finally reached the right person." The officer laughed, assuming it was a joke, and the conversation moved on to easier things, the way conversations do, old grievances about station rations. A wedding on Farana Prime that neither of them had managed to attend. The slow creeping strangeness of growing older in a galaxy that kept getting stranger alongside them. But that night, alone in his quarters, Zeth found himself thinking of the medical bay door, 11 years and one lifetime ago, and the sound of a man's voice, calm and certain and utterly wrong about the size of his own wound, saying 4 words that Zeth had never quite managed to stop turning over in his mind since. He'd meant to write them down once, somewhere official, in a report no one would read. He never had. It had never seemed like the kind of thing that belonged in a report. Some things he had come to believe were meant to be carried rather than filed, held privately, turned over quietly, the way Ellison had once turned a cup of terrible coffee between his hands, needing something to do with the weight of what he knew. Pauluquette asked him about it once, years after the fact, over a comm line grown crackly with distance and time, asked him what he thought Ellison Vance had really been, underneath the calm voice and the impossible calculations and the wounds he refused to name correctly. Zeth thought about it for a long time before he answered. "He was a man who ran out of wars worth fighting for himself," Zeth said, "so he went looking for other people's instead." There was a pause on the line. Pauluquette, in all the years Zeth had known her, had rarely allowed herself a moment of open sentiment. Fahrenheit culture prized restraint the way humans, apparently prized momentum, and she had built her entire career on the strength of that restraint. But something in her voice, when she finally spoke again, carried a weight that had nothing to do with restraint at all. "I looked into it, you know," she said. "After he left, the old records, the ones that don't exist, I wanted to know what a species capable of ending its own wars looked like underneath everything else. I never found his name. I found something else instead, a single line buried in an old historical archive from a survivor's account of the war he wouldn't name. It said that in the last years of that conflict, soldiers on both sides had started leaving supplies for enemy wounded left behind on the field. Not orders, not policy. Just soldiers deciding on their own that the war didn't have to be the only thing they were capable of." "You think that's where he learned it?" "I think," Pauluquette said, "that a species capable of learning mercy in the middle of its own ending was always going to produce men like him, eventually. The only question was whether the rest of the galaxy would be ready when it did." Zeth looked out at the green fields, thinking of 14 children with new names on a transport that had long since reached wherever it was going, thinking of a promise made and kept before it had even finished being spoken, thinking of a man who had once measured the whole of his own suffering against a winter that should have killed him and found, every time since, that the math still came out in favor of walking further. Good thing he found them, Zeth said, echoing words she had spoken once long ago that had never quite stopped being true. There was a pause on the line. Then, quietly, in a voice that carried 11 years of watching one man rewrite everything she thought she knew about strength, Paluket said the only thing that had ever really needed saying about any of it. A good thing he found them.